chapter 39, because we go right through this. Okay, so we have Joseph, and here he is. He's a slave in Potiphar's household, and he is falsely accused. But to start off with, the Lord prospered Joseph within his circumstances based on Joseph's faithfulness. He was sold to Potiphar. Potiphar, over time, he put him in charge of the whole household and trusted him completely. Joseph was apparently a guy that, you've probably met those kind of guys. They seem really competent, they can handle it, and they rise to the top. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph and then falsely accused him of rape. Did that whole thing. He was trying to get away. She held on to his coat. She kept the coat as he, scrambled away. Not the coat of many colors. That was still back in the other land. It says Potiphar was angry, that his anger was kindled. But it doesn't say at Joseph. Yeah. He had to respond to it. He couldn't accept the word of a slave over his wife, even though, he may very well have known what was going on. And so he had to respond to it. And there's various things. One thing, for example, that he was sent to prison. He wasn't killed. Normally a slave did something like that, they're gone. But he was sent to prison instead. Oh, and who was in charge of prison? Potiphar. So then in prison, again, the Lord prospered Joseph within his circumstances based on Joseph's faithfulness. I deliberately used the same phrase as the first part because where Joseph was, where he found himself, that's where it happened. And like Joseph, we are not immune from trials. We still have them. John 16:33, these things I have spoken to you, and in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. So we're going to have trials. Unfortunately, there's no way around it. Don't think it a strange thing when you've got a fiery trial. I mean, it's a normal state of affairs for us. It's part of how God grows us, part of how he uses it, part of what we go through. And sometimes it's for other reasons. It's for reasons outside of ourselves. Count it all joy when you hit various trials. I'm not very good at that one. Sometimes, but not usually. But there's a reason behind it. And one of the reasons is so that we can comfort other people who have gone through or are going through the same thing. Chapter 40, and we're talking about 2 more dreams. Dreams, and more dreams. This one gets really interesting because we have Pharaoh, where we have 2 of his servants have been tossed into jail. Doesn't say why Pharaoh was angry or why these 2 were tossed into jail. It is possible, and a reasonable speculation, that poison was found. And they didn't know whether it was the baker or the guy with the cup that wanted to use the poison. Or that the taste tester died, and they didn't know whether it was the wine he had drunk or the food. Yeah. But these are the 2 food people. These are the 2 food people that in the last in the chain, food people. And so Joseph was in the prison. As the chief trustee, he was being put over the whole prison. Pharaoh's butler and baker were tossed in. They had these dreams, and they told them to Joseph. Joseph interpreted. God gave Joseph true interpretations. And Joseph was always careful to do something. He always was careful to give God the credit for the dream interpretations. Over and over you see, he doesn't say, I interpreted the dreams. He said, God gives the interpretation. Daniel did the same thing. And indeed, the butler was to be restored within 3 days. The baker was to be hung. You guys remember that story? When the butler got restored to his comfortable position, he forgot all about Joseph. It wasn't. You can understand why that would be awkward for him to bring that up to the Pharaoh. Here's this guy of ultimate power. His word is life and death, and you're trying to talk to him about this guy in prison. You can see why he would be hesitant, but...
I could see that he actually could have forgotten.
Yeah.
And he could. Yeah.
Not right away, but...
Well, yeah, they forgot me at Target.
Did they forget, or was it deliberate?
That was just today. That was just today. Okay.
Okay, today then it wasn't deliberate. Okay, so the chief butler, they were in high offices. They were put into Potiphar's control. Potiphar put them in the same. He put them in the same prison under Joseph. Both the baker and the butler could have been taste or died. We talked about that. The interpretation belongs to God. Tell them to me actually puts Joseph in the role of a priest. He's saying God will give interpretation. Tell the dream to me, and I can get this interpretation. He was a slave or in prison for 13 years. He was a slave for about 10 years and in prison for another 3. Sometimes trials can go on for a long time, a lot longer than what we're expecting. It doesn't mean God's not faithful, doesn't mean that he's not working his perfect work. Just sometimes it takes a while to go through. There were 2 full years between Joseph interpreting the butler's dream and the butler bringing it up to Pharaoh. He had been in prison for about a year. These guys joined him. It was 2 years later. And you could see it. You could see Joseph. He'd be going, all right, he's going to talk to Pharaoh. No. And, just that disappointment, that 2 years of waiting. It is amazing that he wasn't bitter. And
Anthony,
Joseph did not take credit for the interpretation. He always was wise to recognize and give credit to the Lord. So, chapter 41. More dreams. Lots of dreams here. This time we have Pharaoh dreaming. Interesting stuff about it, though. We have the dreams themselves are bizarre. 7 beautiful cows, and then ugly cows that come up and eat them and stay ugly, and 7 stalks of grain, and then 7 thin heads come up and devour them. So the weird dreams. But he wants to know what they mean. That's reasonable. Here's what's bizarre. He had these magicians and wise men in his court, okay? And they didn't make up something. I'm really surprised. I would have thought that they would have just said, okay, I don't know what that means. Okay, here's what it means, O Pharaoh. And they would have made up something. But they did have some satanic power. And we know that because of the whole thing with Moses. And they were tricksters, and they would, turn their own staffs into serpents. And then Moses' serpent would eat up theirs. And they would turn water into blood themselves. And, there were various things. They did have satanic powers, and maybe the fact that this was a God-given dream just totally stumped them.
I wish I would have got one of these dreams at some point, a few times in my life.
I hear you. We all want God to guide us.
maybe you're just not old enough yet.
Hey, I like her. Okay, so the butler finally remembers Joseph. Oh yeah, dreams. This guy, dreams. And so Joseph had now been in prison for about 3 years. He comes back, he gives the king great advice, he interprets the dreams. It clicks. It's obvious that the Pharaoh, can we find one such as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? That it obviously resonated in a way that Pharaoh recognized. Okay, this guy's got it. This guy really has it. He really understands it. And he called Joseph a really long name, which means the man to whom secrets are revealed. Zaphenthephaneah, something like that. And he was made second command over all of Egypt. Again, he rose to power. I mean, it was, he literally, it was, could say anything just like the Pharaoh could. And he got married to a priestess, and he had 2 sons Ephraim and Manasseh. He had the 7 good years. He collected the grain. He did all the taxing and pulled it all in. And they were fantastic good years. They couldn't even count all the grain. They were building storehouses so quick and, trying to store it all. And the famine, sure enough, came as predicted. And it made the Pharaoh rich. We'll talk about that in a minute. And saved the people. In 42, we've got the brothers. And they're in the famine. They've been in the famine for about a year. And they're coming along and they say, hey, I hear there's grain in Egypt. And we're starving. Let's go get some. So they're pretty desperate. This is about 21 years after Jesus had been sold as a slave. The first time that they came.
Joseph.
What?
Joseph.
You said Jesus.
Oh, since Joseph was sold as a slave.
I knew what you meant.
The brothers didn't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognized him, and the scripture says it remembers his dream of them bowing down. You can understand why they wouldn't recognize him, though. Here, second in Egypt, he would be in full Egyptian garb. Totally Egyptian garb, the Egyptian thing, and, it would be radically different. He's 21 years older. He was this, 17-year-old, but now he's, definitely a full man. Joseph chose Simeon as a hostage, put him in prison, and he returned their money to them secretly as they left. They didn't recognize Joseph. He was dressed like an Egyptian, and also he spoke through an interpreter. He deliberately masked it. He spoke Egyptian, and so they didn't know he spoke Hebrew. Years later, this is 21 years later, and they're saying, why is this happening? Why are we being, why this thing with Simeon? Their brain immediately goes to Joseph. We're in Egypt. We sold him into slavery. Their brain immediately, they're still bearing that guilt. It says that you can infer that it wasn't really easy for Joseph to be stern with his brothers. In one sense, you wonder if he was doing it because he felt like, well, I have to fulfill this dream. The way he would go out and wash his face and then come back and continue the act. Mm-hmm. It's hard to say. It's hard to say how much was what. When they came back, shows that Reuben had a real. He had always been a little bit on the better side, but he had a real change in the sense of he offered his own sons. They needed to get Benjamin and come back, and Reuben said, "I'll offer my sons as surety." And Jacob/Israel wouldn't accept that at that time. He thought everything was horrible. Jacob was convinced that his life was horrible. My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead and he's left alone. If any calamity would befall him along the way in which you go, you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. It's all these things are against me. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and you want to take Benjamin. All these things are against me. You have, Jacob is convinced, okay, this is a horrible situation. Nothing's happening. He doesn't know that God is actually working a miracle.
They probably would have recognized him, but he probably walked like an Egyptian.
Exactly.
Duke Major,
Yeah.
song.